Hello everybody, it's me Julian, and today I would like to provide you with an accessible introduction to Lacan's concept of the big other, or the grand Outre, which is a key component of his psychoanalytic theory. And I thought I'd start with a definition provided by Slavoj Žižek in his book Less Than Nothing, where he writes, "The big other is the agency of all social norms and appearances that confers upon everything a minimal aspect of theatricality," which is a really quite wonderful starting point. Essentially, the big other, conceptualized like this, is the symbolic horizon of all social participation, which is to say, when you enter into the world, you have to learn how to play a character. Indeed, strictly speaking, you have to learn how to play a character which is yourself. You could say that this is the central rule or lesson of the big other, that it's impossible for us to be truly authentic, that in a sense we have to learn to embody the fiction that is ourselves. And the big other is the horizon against which we are able to stage this performance. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you walk into a coffee shop and the barista says, "How is your day going?" If you proceed to give them a blow-by-blow account of everything that's happened in your day, they'll probably raise their eyebrows. What you're expected to do is simply to say, "Yeah, it's great. How's your day?" Essentially, you're giving them a non-answer. You are participating inauthentically. And yet, it's precisely against the backdrop of this inauthentic participation that you are able to participate in social life. And Lacan therefore says that even when you are lying in the symbolic order, in the face of the big other, you are nevertheless speaking the truth, i.e. you are continuing to function and participate. It's like a miniature version of the noble lie. You are supposed to play along. You are supposed to follow the rules. And what's important to note here is that there's a tension between the particular and the universal. In fact, you could make the argument that the big other is the universal grounding against which the particular can assert himself as such. I'll give you an example from one of my favorite TV shows called Peep Show, a comedy series. And one character is a man who's struggling with self-confidence. And his friend says, well, what you have to do is every day you have to look into the mirror and you have to say to yourself, "I am the man," before going out into the world. And so the next morning, the man wakes up and he looks into the mirror, but instead of saying, "I am the man," he says, "I am a man." And he says to himself repeatedly throughout the day, "I am a man, I am a man." And it becomes somewhat comedic, tragicomic perhaps. And yet here we have the fundamental antagonism of the big other versus the particular subject. The staging of "I am the man" can only occur against the universal horizon of man in general, a man. And so the point, therefore, is to prove that you are the man against and above all other men. It is in this precise sense that Lacan essentially argues that masculinity is fake, i.e. it is a noble lie that is staged against the horizon of the symbolic order. Now, another argument that Lacan makes, and Žižek extrapolates from, is that, strictly speaking, there is no big other. And this is sometimes misinterpreted as saying that there is no big other is an existential declaration about the death of God, and that in the absence of said overarching deity and all-seeing eye, we are left to fend for ourselves. And yet, that's not strictly speaking what Lacan means. What Lacan means when he says there is no big other is that the big other is, strictly speaking, virtual, i.e. he is created retroactively by means of our own participation as if there were a big other. In fact, Žižek likes to invert Voltaire's quip that if there were no God, it would be necessary to invent him, by saying that the Lacanian big other essentially holds that if there is no God, we invent him even if we don't want to, which is to say, simply by means of participating against the horizon of a symbolic order, we invoke an invisible matrix that seems to govern our actions, even though it is not there. It is, strictly speaking, virtual. In fact, what might be helpful here is to link Lacan's argument about the big other to surplus enjoyment. Lacan's basic proposition is that we participate in front of or for the big other. We perform a fiction of ourselves for the big other because it gives us surplus enjoyment. I have an example from my own life. The other day I was driving on a community campus that was completely abandoned, and at a certain point I signaled left, even though there were no other cars in the immediate vicinity, no one was there, no pedestrians, no guards, and yet nevertheless I signaled left. So why was I doing that? Well, strictly speaking, I signaled left for the big other, which is to say, I signaled left because it gives me a form of surplus enjoyment to do it precisely because nobody is watching. In fact, if I were being watched and told to signal left, I probably wouldn't want to do it. Therefore, Lacan argues that acting as ourselves, performing as ourselves for the big other in its virtual absent guise gives us surplus enjoyment. And ironically, we therefore experience our own freedom precisely as a kind of submissive gesture towards this virtual space of the big other. And I'd like to conclude this video by relating the big other to its little cousin, namely the little other. If the big other is the socio-symbolic horizon of rules, social rules and appearances against which all social actions appear theatrical, the little other is the horizon of our own participation, the horizon of our own enjoyment. Or to put that a little bit more technically, essentially we have the overlapping of two lacks, as Žižek likes to put it. There is a lack in the big other, i.e. it is not there, it is barred, it is universally virtual. And yet this mirrors the lack in the subject, the barred subject, the subject of the death drive. Therefore, the subject, in order to overcome his own lack, projects an absence of lack onto the big other, which is to say that the big other and the little other work in a dialectical tandem, fulfilling and overlapping each other's lack. Therefore, it is only against the absence, the barred nature of the big other, that the subject can enter into the performance of his own supposed authenticity. Therefore, to conclude, the Lacanian maxim, the Lacanian lesson is quite simple. You are your own mask. There's nothing underneath the mask that is an authentic you. In fact, this performance of your mask is precisely the obligation or the task of the subject as an individual. Therefore, the virtual staging of who you are contains more truth than who you believe you are underneath. In fact, it's one of the tropes of a very evil person that they say, well, I only appear evil to you, but if you knew me privately, you would know that I am a good person indeed. The Lacanian lesson is the exact opposite. It is only who you are through the refracted social appearance that constitutes who you really are. This is why Žižek argues that, strictly speaking, there is more truth to the digital avatars that you choose online than there is to the person who you are underneath. Therefore, the Lacanian supplemental maxim, you are your own mask, points towards the manner in which the big other is barred, the big other is virtual, the big other does not exist. Therefore, the lack in the big other is supplemented by the lack in the subject. That is the big other, or the grand outre. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to download my lectures and my recurring ebook subscription, simply take a look at my Patreon. I will see you tomorrow.